Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. Episode 2, Characteristics of Civilization Explained. In this episode, we will be exploring what the 7 characteristics of civilization are and how they relate to Paleolithic-era people versus Mesopotamian people. Also, after I say the end, I'm still going to say something after. It is just the end of the presentation. In this episode, we are not going to strictly be talking about Mesopotamian people, but instead letting you get a grasp of what the characteristics of civilization are and comparing and contrasting two eras of people so that you can get a good grasp of it first before strictly discussing about Mesopotamian people. Let's get started now. Welcome to episode 2 of Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. This episode is about the characteristics of civilization, and today we are going to be comparing Mesopotamia and the Paleolithic era people. We aren't delving deeper and talking strictly about Mesopotamia because that is in the next episode. So stay tuned, you might learn some new things during this episode, and if you already know these things, give yourself a pat on the back. So here are the 7 characteristics of civilization. 1. A stable food supply. 2. A social structure. 3. A system of government. 4. A religious system. 5. A highly developed way of life. 6. Advances in technology. 7. A highly developed written language. First, a stable food supply. If you don't have a stable food supply, then you aren't able to be classified as a civilization. That is because the people of a society or a civilization need to have enough food to survive. For example, Paleolithic people weren't classified as a civilization because they hunted and gathered and they didn't have a stable food supply, since the animals would migrate or the animals would die out from excessive hunting, the plants might die out because of excessive gathering or not enough time to regrow. So that's basically why they didn't have a stable food supply. But an example of people being listed as a civilization is Mesopotamia having large farms and irrigation systems, therefore getting a stable food supply, because as long as they had land, they could expand their irrigation system and grow more food for the increasing population. Second, a social structure. If you don't have a social structure, you won't be considered a civilization. For example, the Mesopotamians have a social structure which contains the lower class, middle class, and high class. The lower class includes slaves, which were usually captured in wars. The middle class included people such as farmers, artisans, metal workers, etc. And the high class included people such as kings, government officials, and priests. Paleolithic people are also not considered a civilization because they were alone, and one person cannot constitute a whole social structure. Third, a system of government. To be considered a civilization, you need to have a government. That is because you cannot leave people to do any bad thing they want. For example, Mesopotamia has a system of government. It's basically monarchy and religion merged together, since a lot of their laws are based on their religious beliefs, and they had a king who was supposedly ruled by the gods. So it's basically like monarchy and religion merged together. Also, a written set of laws called the Code of Hammurabi has been well preserved over the thousands of years that they have existed. Another example of why Paleolithic people are not considered a civilization is because they didn't have a system of government because of isolation and because they weren't developed enough to develop a language and communicate. A or some religious systems. To be considered a civilization, you need to have a religious system or some religious systems. For example, Mesopotamia is considered a civilization because many of their laws and rules and even their monarchy is based on religion, like I said earlier. The Paleolithic people aren't a civilization because they didn't have religion and because they weren't capable of processing anything like that. Another reason that the Paleolithic people aren't considered to be a civilization is that they didn't have a language, therefore they weren't able to write down what their religion is about or what their laws were about. Mesopotamian people have a written language which they could use to record what their religion was about. A highly developed way of life. You are not considered a civilization until you have a highly developed way of life. For example, the Paleolithic people aren't considered a civilization because they have no highly developed way of life. They didn't have a stable food supply, no language, they didn't cook their food, they weren't able to make things like irrigation systems, they didn't work together, etc. But the Mesopotamians are like the opposite. They did have a stable food supply, they did have a language, they did cook their food, they were able to make things like irrigation systems, they did work together, etc. Advances in technology. If you didn't have any advances in technology, you wouldn't be considered a civilization. In this example, the Paleolithic people did advance in technology. For example, they found a use for fire which is used in our daily lives. Another example is Mesopotamia. They made irrigation, they made the wheel, they made a language, they made new tools, etc. Lastly, a highly developed written language. If you don't have a highly developed written language, you won't be considered a civilization. Before the Mesopotamians, people didn't have a written language, so they weren't considered real civilizations. The Mesopotamians developed an advanced written language to express their thoughts, ideas, beliefs, which further qualifies them as a civilization. Thank you for watching. The end. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. Please make sure to hit the bell icon for notifications too. If you wanted to see how exactly the 7 characteristics of civilization related to Mesopotamians' technological advancements, check out the next episode. Thank you. Bye.